So we're going to talk about vulnerability management in operational technology this morning. My name is Kylie McClanahan. I'm the CTO of a company called Bastazo. We do vulnerability remediation and prioritization for OOT. And I'll let Alex introduce himself.
My name's Assante. I'm a security consultant at a company called NST. And that's my day job. My day job is working within the operational technology fields, working with utilities and doing nurse compliance primarily, but also doing other compliance regulatory standards for operational technology, with structure, like roster sectors.
Perfect. So we're gonna talk this morning about OT. So I want to set your expectations here at the start. What this is. We're going to talk about common problems. We're going to talk about in particular why vulnerability management is more difficult than you would expect. To try to run IT's past background and some reasons why it needs to be approached differently. What this is not, it's not a NERC tutorial. If you don't know what NERC is, you're about to learn. So just get ready. It's also not a technical deep stuff. Providing as an overview with hopefully enough detail to be helpful and not making you slog through all of the details. So, what is 15? It stands for Operational Technology Day. It's our part to IT. About OT, we're talking about systems that have physical consequences or deal with physical in environments as opposed to systems that for information technology are more activation measures. Other intros titled for reading. You have terminology here, but ought to be a little bit clear on. OT, you have ICS, your industrial control systems. Again, helpful term, a system that controls an industrial process. These are often used interchangeably. There's an overlap. We'll look at that in just a second. Many times these systems overlap with critical infrastructure, which are systems that are vital to national interests, regardless of what nation that may be. In the States, CISA defines 16 critical infrastructure sectors. I'm not going to read them all to you. You have eyes. The waste of all their kind. Many of these are operational or industrial in environments. Things like the chemical sector, energy, dams, water, wastewater, transportation. Some of them are not. You'll notice there is one that is just called information technology sector. That one is not OT. You're all smart people. Trust you know that. When we talk about terms, this is what I will call the Venn diagram of terminology. I'm going to give you some examples, and somewhere it's going to find a case, and they're going to say, that doesn't fit in your diagram. I'm just going to apologize in advance. It happens. Okay. Yeah, ICS as sort of a subset of broader operational technology that overlaps with critical infrastructure. For example, our electric grid sits right there in the middle of all three. Healthcare is critical infrastructure. It is operational technology. You can look at an MRI machine. There are physical components moving around there. An MRI machine, I would say, is not an industrial control system. Doesn't mean it still have some of the difficulties, right? There comes a point where splitting hairs isn't helpful. But to give you some examples, the financial sector is critical infrastructure. It's not OT or ICS. And then we have something in here like non-critical manufacturing. If you're wondering why I use that term, it's because critical manufacturing, it is. Critical manufacturing is one of our sectors right here. So non-critical manufacturing would go outside of that overlap. The last one I'll give you is HVAC, very heating, cooling air system, which I'll put right on the line. You could call it ICS, you could call it not ICS, and you're kind of right either way. It is non-critical infrastructure, although living in Arkansas, I would argue that it is. Um, just saying, but it's not necessarily vital to national interests. As we get into some of the differences here, I want to talk about the CIA triad for a second. Your very standard confidentiality, integrity of availability. The first slide in any InfoSec class. It's when people talk about OTs, the first thing you'll often hear, and many times you'll hear this for someone coming from IT or security background looking at OT. Like easy, you just flip it. Availability is the most important as opposed to confidentiality. That is not incorrect. But I want to be a little bit more specific because we're really looking at a different perspective. When these systems are built, you're not considering necessarily your CIA triad. You're considering safety, reliability, and performance. Now, when people say we just split the triad, availability is key, this is really what they mean. This system staying up, if you're an electric grid, providing reliable power every time someone flicks a light switch, you could say that it's availability. So I'm going to say they're not wrong. But when we're building, designing, and operating systems, these are the things that are most important. And so if you're talking with operators, particularly in an environment that does not have a dedicated security team, you're talking about cybersecurity, and you have to know or remember these principles to be able to communicate effectively. Al's going to talk about some of the differences that we see in these environments.
So, to start off here, a lot of the operational technologies that we're going to talk about are utilities. There are electric utilities, there are gas utilities, there are oil utilities, there are water utilities, chemical utilities, lots of different utilities out there. And that's primarily what we're looking at in operational technology. No, but the important thing to remember here is that the priority of utility is a little bit different than you might have in the IT world or any other world out there. The first priority is going to be operations and reliability, right? A power plant has to be on, has to provide power 20, all the time. We're always using power, so whether it's, even at night, and in our homes, in our at work, we're constantly consuming electricity. We need those power plants online, right? And then you have safety being key and critical. If a power plant explodes in the middle of the night, we got a big problem. The network might crash. That could be a different story. But if something goes boom, when you're working with gas, working with power, you're working with electrons, that could be a big problem. And so that's going to be a second priority that a lot of utilities face. And then finally, security. Security is key and important, but it's a balance, right? And what cybersecurity that's critical for ensuring safe and reliable operations. We're not doing security for security's sake. It's about managing the risks and not chasing perfection if a balance is necessary. And we'll get more into that here later. So when we're talking about what's at stake, the biggest things here that core utility priorities that I mentioned before, the operational reliability, safety, and security, they require vulnerability management in a robust approach. Passion isn't just about security or compliance, which we're going to get into grip day. It's about keeping the lights on. It's about making sure that these critical sectors are there and available for when they're needed, necessary, and making sure that we're keeping them secure. So, to give an example by something we're going to be talking about here, it's important to kind of frame your mind. We're talking about OT versus IT, and talk about why does it matter? Why is it different? What are some of the different challenges? One of the examples here today is that compliance, regulation, and security can be a little bit different. We change our perspectives here. When we're talking about compliance, there is, not necessarily a focus on revenue. Of course, every company needs to make money, so that is important. But with compliance, we have to be compliant to these standards, and compliance to the standards can also result in, can result in revenue, can also result in fines, fees, and other problems. And as we're going to get into later, to kind of give you an idea of some of the impact of this, There was a generation facility that I've worked on and been to, and one day they had an outage that was unscheduled and unplanned. For various reasons, they could not go online, and the independent system operator and balancing authority for the region asked them to turn on. Now, this region asked them to turn on for 5 20-minute windows. So they were only needed to be on that day for a total of just under 2 hours of time producing power. They were not able to turn on. And because of that, the region ended up giving them millions of dollars in fines and fees just on top of the lost revenue from this company. That means that it kind of shows you that the availability of these resources is important, right? And so when we're talking about vulnerability management and talking about, making sure that our time, we're looking at the right time window, we're looking at the right assets, we're looking at the right priorities here, it's key to remember that one of the biggest aspects you have to focus on is availability, because availability is crucial in this space. So a little bit about why it should care. We're talking start having a compliance and regulation piece of it. If you're in a regulated industry, this is your everything, right? This is what you have to deal with. This is what you do. If you're unregulated, we'll talk about this later. Don't worry, you might do it later soon. That for better or for worse. If you're a researcher, this is important. You're helping keep things pure. We want all the researchers here to be looking at, the IT and the OT world at a full hard mindset. There are key differences that are important to understand, to making sure that, the research is benefiting not just the IT world, but also benefiting the OT world alongside. And of course, you're a vendor. We have, why you're here. You're helping provide all the assets, the resources, and the time to make sure that this all works. So the OT reality check, as I've been talking through, is just reliability first, right? We have continuous operations, the availability, and all of these require cybersecurity, vulnerability management, and all these things, right? We're going to go through many key things such as maintenance and security patch that can be seen in our production. Now we have to have reliability and safety that takes precedence over all of these things. So we're talking about why is vulnerability management far in the space. There's a couple different very common problems and themes here, such as non-homogeneous environments. In the INS world, you might see a facility with thousands of devices that might only use 5 OSs and 5 vendors in the IT space. But in the OT space, you might see a generation facility with only 250 assets, right? Much smaller scale. However, those 250 assets use 30 different vendors, technologies, and 12 different OSs, right? When you start looking at patch management and doing a patch rollout, you're looking at a much bigger problem. You're doing 250 assets with just different technology versus when you're looking at many, many, many more assets, but only 5 OSs. And imagine all some becomes a really bit easier. When you were looking at, the different asset discoveries and a different asset management principle, depending on the criticality of your assets and depending on, what regulations you have, you might have to keep asset lists, you might not. Either way, even if you have asset lists or enough in your system, all the time you see it's common that without robust asset management systems in place, it is super easy to miss an asset. Even with robust things in place, it is super, super easy to miss an asset and to realize you're not patching assets because you're not doing vulnerability mitigation on these places. Because again, going back to non-homogeneous environments, we're working with 250 assets using all sorts of different technologies, all interconnected in different states, encrypt over different reasons. Now, when talking about end of life, end of sale systems, in the OT world, it is very, very, very common to see devices that are end of life, end of sale, and support, and definitely legacy systems. For many different reasons. Some being that, of course, there's not a good place out there market. I've seen multiple times at facilities that have an asset that breaks down, and they have required using the gray markets to actually replace a device. I can tell you how many times I've seen people pulled up on a computer trying to find the right asset to replace that generation facility because they're just not a good replacement out there, and they have to go find the legacy systems. And to kind of give everyone a little bit of perspective from that legacy here, in my 3 years working with a bunch of utilities, I personally have seen out in the field running critical assets and running just important assets to a lot of different utilities. I've seen Windows 7, Windows XP, right? Nothing too crazy here, Windows 10, of course. I've also seen Windows NT 93 and Windows 3.1 running critical key important assets that are operating your grid, operating your gas, operating your oil, operating your water, and operating all these different things. It's important to realize that we're not just working with brand new systems that were easy to replace, hot swaps. We're working with some kinds of a lot of devices that have no good replacements, run on really old software. And it's going to be really important when it comes down to bundle integration and being neat, being creative, and making sure you can handle those different types of devices, especially with all the infections. Now, again, another key impact here is devices for operation and not for security. While the OT world, we use a lot of IT assets, right? We use switches, we use starter. We use a lot of the same things. We also use different things, such as a relay that's going to operate a breaker. This would be mainly its job for operation. Its job is to make sure that breaker opens or closes to prevent it could go all down the line to make sure we can keep power running. Now, that device might do really good at its job and really good at operating, but that device might be very bad at security. They might have weak password controls, which is super common. No certificates, no VPN, right? None of these security controls or measures that we're used to in an IT world, it's often missing on OT assets. And so we have to make sure that when we're looking at vulnerability mitigation, we're taking that into account that we might not have the right security controls on these devices. And so we have to make sure if we can mitigate that some other way. Now, geographical dispersion can be a problem. And this depends on what kind of utility you are, what kind of services you provide, what kind of assets you use. The biggest example for this is going to be if you are an electric utility, especially your distribution or transmission, you're going to have a lot of substations, right? And at the substations, you're going to have anywhere, let's say, from 10 to 200 assets or more. Now, when you look at it, okay, I got one substation, 200 assets. Great, that's one. Now, let's add in the other 500 substations that I know. And across all of those different assets, I might have assets spread over tens of thousands of square miles across different states, across different regions, and sometimes even across, country borders and lines, right? It's very common in the interactivity of the Northeast to have a Canadian power company that's connected into the U.S. and they have assets reside in the U.S., not Canada, right? And so a lot of these assets, especially in this space, have to be patched manually, right? And when you get through manual patching, and now you're looking at your assets spread out over tens of thousands of square miles, that becomes a much bigger problem. The next problem we're going to get, of course, is the availability problem. Again, talking about how you have to be available, right? Availability is kind of almost twofold. How many of you in this room would be comfortable if your power company said, okay, guys, sorry, we're going to have to turn off your lights for a reason because we have to patch our systems. Necessary evil, right? Sadly, personally, I wouldn't be willing to do that. I left my power. I like being able to do my dishes at night, run the laundry, watch TV, all those fun things. But, you have to be available. Your gas company can't just turn off your gas to do a patch for you, right? The availability is key. And from an incentive value, of course, if you're merchant generation, your availability is your key moneymaker. If you're there, you're making money. If you're on, you're making money. Availability can also be a problem if you're not available, like I mentioned before. They weren't available for almost 2 hours of a single day, and they lost millions of dollars in fines and fees, not to even do the revenue loss for not being there. Right? Availability is key, and it's important in the OT space. It's a much bigger problem. While you might have in the IT world, let's say Saturday night is my time for patching. Everything, the service is paused for 3 hours while you patch it. That's great. I can't do that on power utility. I can't turn off the power for 3 hours. I have to have availability for outage windows and schedules, which becomes a much bigger problem. Especially when you look at vendor maintenance, right? If we're looking at vendor maintenance, we might have to have certain key aspects in critical systems that vendors only the vendors are allowed to work on the machines. Or we have to use the vendors to get patches, or we need the vendors to do all these sort of things for us in running these plants. When it comes down to the availability of vendors, the availability of their technicians, the availability of our technicians, right? It becomes really difficult. We're looking at availability window to say, hey, when can I turn off my power? When can I turn off my gas services? When can I get this work done? Because when we're looking at it, it just becomes, there's so many things that go into it, right? At a substation, you might have outage windows that are large, but typically only when you're retrofitting a substation, right? Most of the outage windows you bring in a substation, you're keeping small windows, but again, you need power. So you need it there. While you might get route power, through another substation for a brief period of time while you're having patching, you want that backed up for the reliability and resilience of the grid, right? If you're looking at a generation facility, we often have what's called the shoulder month or the shoulder season, where when it's not hot and it's not cold, that power company can finally take an outage. That power, that generation, so it can finally turn off their generators and say, okay, great. We need you to go do all of this low maintenance, all this upstream patch it. We need you to go and replace all these different systems. We need you to get ready for the next shoulder season, with the next season of heating, of cooling, of power, because we have a limited time windows when we can actually get in and do these outages. So there's a lot of key components and problems that just are so different. And that's, of course, before we even get to regulation. When we get to regulation, it becomes a much bigger problem. Because there is a game of compliance versus security. Compliance does not equal security, and security does not equal compliance. And that's in two different ways, right? You can be secure and not compliant, and vice versa. But, regulatory standards and cyber threats are always evolving, and that's definitely not always in parallel. Often not. Your regulations are often lagging behind the cyber threats. You're catching up to the new and improved cyber threats years, sometimes even decades later, with your regulations. And one of the largest challenges in regulatory compliance can be sometimes the interpretation. So a lot of these standards can be written open-ended, and that's both the strength and the weakness, right? The strength allows for the flexibility in complying to the standard, right? We're not going to expect the 10-person mom and pop generation shop to have the exact same compliance program, do the exact same things, and need the exact same things as a 10,000 employee, utility company that owns 500 substations, 4 nuclear facilities, all these different things, right? We need flexibility in the standards. We need that interpretation for flexibility so that everyone can follow these standards. And, another strength from it is it offers a minimum level of security. When you're working in the compliance world, we often can sometimes see, let's do the minimum level. Let's check the box. Right? We are compliant. Do what we have to do. Check that box, become compliant, and move on. Right? And for better or worse, regulations at least provide some minimum level of security. Right? They give you a minimum level of security that that these utilities, these plants, and entities, these companies have to follow and have to do to make sure they stay compliant. So at least know they're there. But above and beyond is great. But still, it's important to know that security and compliance, they don't necessarily, of course, go hand in hand. For compliance, you have to be what you say you're going to do. Your programs and process document. If you go above and beyond for cybersecurity, I applaud you. Great, thank you. I'm super happy if my power's very well secure, because I like that. I mentioned before. I like my oil water when gas like I want. So please be safe. Please invest a lot of cybersecurity. However, make sure when you're doing it feasibly, right? There is a key balance here, because if I go above and beyond the minimum level of security requirements, and then I say I'm going to do that, my compliance program, now if I don't go above and beyond, I'm now not compliant. Maybe I'm secure still, but I'm now not compliant, right? So if you're doing the minimum level, if you're meeting compliance, you might not be secure fully, but you're compliant. If I go above and beyond, and even if I go past the minimum level of security, I manage to do that, but I still have even a little bit more on top of that I'm not able to do, even though I say I'm going to do it. I know I'm not compliant, even though I found way above and beyond the standards, but because I didn't do what I said I was going to do, I'm not compliant. So there's a balance between, again, compliance and security, and making sure we're doing it in an easy way, something that's feasible and something that's secure, something that's compliant. Now, primarily, some of the standards that we work on, and some of the robust standards out there in the US, the NERC standards. Now, the NERC standards cover everything from asset and system categorization, which is pointers and controls, your personnel management and training, your ESPs, electronic security perimeters, your physical security perimeters, your system security management, incident reporting, response and planning, recovery plans, configuration change management, information protection, communications, supply chain risks, and physical security. And there's a lot there. They cover many, many different things. But, and these are great. Maybe it's great that they cover all of this within the standards. But today, primarily, this is focusing on vulnerability, mitigation and management. We're going to be focusing on SIP-7. Now, SIP-7 is system security management, and the 5 requirements, there's many sub-requirements in these 5 requirements, but the 5 requirements are mainly logical and physical port security, security patch management, which is a big one, as you can see by the red box here. It's malicious code prevention, security event monitoring, and system access control. All great things we're looking at vulnerability management and mitigation. Now, while there are other standards that are out there that have something to do with vulnerability management, such as SIP3, SIP10, also have a little piece of vulnerability management in them. SIP7 is just the standard most important vulnerability management, especially from an ongoing perspective. Now, the R2 here, it's important to note that SIP7 itself, specifically R2, is one of the most violating standards of NERC compliance, which of course means this standard, specifically this requirement, is the most common non-compliance that you find out in the industry. This is the most common reason you're getting fined. This is the most common places that auditors are finding problems. This is sometimes your biggest issue. And it's vulnerability management mitigation, specifically SIP7 R2 patching. Now, and this is due for a couple different reasons, right? We're looking at security patch management program. We're looking at discovery and notification of available cybersecurity patches. That's your first step, right? You have to discover or get notified of available cybersecurity patches to your assets. Once you do that, your calendar gets started. There's a timer. You start. You now have 70 days. Now, the 70 days will be split into two different blocks. You have 35 calendar days to evaluate security patches for applicability, making sure that those actually matter to you, right? You might see the security patch. You need to go now review it, evaluate it, and make sure, hey, does this make sense? Does this apply to my assets? Do I need to actually apply the patch? Then, once that's done, you now have another 35 calendar days among the evaluation completion to now apply the patch, create a data mitigation plan, or advise an existing mitigation plan. Like I said, for many reasons, this is the most violated standard, right? You realize that you're not patching an asset because you missed it, and it's in the asset management and inventory slide that we're talking about before. You missed an asset. You realize you're not patching, right? Common violation. You have a calendar, right? That starts upon the discovery of a patch. When you have vendors that are releasing daily patches on you don't want to look at those patches daily. It's like, you don't want to look at them hourly. You want to be making sure you have good time windows and time management skills to make sure when you're looking at your patches and you're looking for those, you know when that calendar is going to start. You're ready for that 70-day window. And of course, keeping a 70-day window might sound, easy, might sound hard. And any way, shape, or form, of course, we all have priorities that we have to balance. We all have different things that we're doing here all at the same time, and things slip through cracks, right? But when you have a 70-day time window compared to, a once-a-year time window or a 15-month time window, when your time window is 70 days, it's super easy when you actually miss something to all of a sudden be outside that calendar and realize you have a non-compliance, realize you violated the standard. And so, the OT regulatory landscape, though, there's much more out there, right? A lot of these problems I focused on today were from the NERC SIP standards. I wanted to focus on the NERC SIP standards, but that's where I've seen most of these things out there. But of course, there's others, right? There's the NERC SIP standards. There's the NERC OMP standards, which is also sell electricity. Water right now is deal with the current D2SI standards. The oil pipelines and railways also have the TSA security directives, which are current regulations that are out there. And of course, out in the future, they're talking about water and wastewater system sectors getting regulations to make sure there's some good security there. And of course, there's always going to be changes. Regulations are always evolving. They're adapting to threats. They're moving up. They're moving forward. And it's important to know that when we're dealing with regulation, we cannot forget it. It is a security game, but it's also a compliance. You have to make sure you're making things secure. You're patching vulnerabilities. You're doing mitigation. Gotta check that evidence. You shouldn't have lots of other support work going on top of that. And so you need to make sure that when you're doing this, or if your industry is coming up, you're getting regulations are changing, that you're staying on top of it, making sure you understand the security control that you do, the security practices you're going to have to do, as well as all the work that's going to take for evidence, for all the other support activities that are going to go into compliance regulation. Once is enough. But, the future of regulation is written by today's vulnerabilities. It takes one incident to become regulated. It takes one outage, one cyber attack. The 2003 Northeast blackout caused the NERC SIP standards today that have now been here for over 20 years. The future of regulation is important. Okay? So now that even if you aren't regulated yet, you do need to pay attention. You do need to realize that it can be coming. The Colonial Pipeline attack that was a few years ago caused the TSA 5.1 security standards. There have been talks, but it took an outage. It took an incident to make it fully come into fruition. So even if your industry today isn't regulated, know that it can be on the horizon. Or if it is regulated, know that one more incident, one more outage, that can cause more regulations, that can cause a change to the regulations. Just understanding that this is an ever-changing system, an ever-changing process is important. You have to be ready for that and realize that if it comes, you'll have access. If you'll outside, you'll have the availability to be ready. Now, I'm going to hand this back over to Kylie to talk a little bit more about the data needs when it comes to OT vulnerability.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. And I'll make one addition here. For those of you in the room who are not in OT and who are in the IT realm, the concern of regulation is just one more difficulty on the pile. This is a map of the 2003 northeast blackout, where, to simplify a very complex set of events, it was a hot day, power lines sag, it's material science, sag in the heat, sagged, hit a tree, shorted out. Essentially, you have a power vacuum in the most literal sense of the term, that caused a cascading blackout across the Northeast US, while simultaneously a race condition in monitoring software meant that it was not noticed by the utility whose territory it occurred in. That led through some congressional congressional mandate. Thank you. No one used that term, so sorry, it's early. Through a congressional mandate to lead to the NERC standards. Like Alex said, an incident with ransomware and Colonial Pipeline, where they shut down their OT operation because they could not bill, led to the TSA directives. And yes, it's that TSA is the one that stands when you go to the airport. So we're going to talk a little bit about the data needs here, because they have different data needs. In particular, vulnerability metadata, which we all know very well. This is not always helpful to practitioners. That is not me saying that we don't need it. It's still very important. But knowing that vulnerability is a buffer overflow does not really give you a lot of helpful information about what to do about it. Okay? Again, that's not me saying that we need to get rid of CWE. Please do not go say them. But I said that it's crucial for these secure by design type initiatives to write secure software to eliminate classes of vulnerabilities. But it's not always helpful for a practitioner. Is it going to impact the approach to remediation? Likely not. Does it require cybersecurity knowledge? When we talk about SIT, there are a lot of power plants in this country that are staffed exclusively, if not primarily, by engineers, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, because that's what you need to run a plant. They may not have a dedicated cybersecurity team. When the SIP standards went into effect, you had a lot of engineering staff all of a sudden being handed the secondary job responsibility of cybersecurity, in many cases without the necessary background or training in cybersecurity. That's not to say they're not very smart people. They do very, very, very well. But when you were learning about firewalls from scratch because your electrical engineering degree did not tell you what a firewall was, particularly 40 years ago, because career spans in this industry are quite long, quite like asset life spans. That may not be information that you just have to hands. And then data quality, and I'm going to mention CPEs. That's not just CPEs. When we're talking about patching or remediation in particular, you have to be able to tell if something is applicable. Especially in OT, you have CPEs missing from vulnerabilities. You have CPEs that do not accurately reflect the current state of a product line. You have CPEs that are incorrect. And I mean, like, just misspelled before you get into so-and-so was acquired by by such and such, but their CPE name is still the old company name, which means that a CDE record is not the primary way that NOT will determine applicability of vulnerabilities. Add to that some complex data relationships. Again, we're no stranger to that. CVEs, patches, mitigations, exploit information, and most crucially, security advisories. That is what we use most frequently to determine what is applicable to a system. Now, a lot of these are many to one. An advisor may contain many CPs and many patches and many assets, and they're not all interconnected to each other. So vendor security advisors become this key avenue to get this information. Affected products and versions will, in most cases, be complete in an advisory, even if they are not in the associated CDE record. Actually, security advisors will also give you insight into cases, not to give everyone a flashback, but things like Log4j, when absolutely everything was affected. Not every affected product had a CPE on that set of loans. Many of them published security advisories detailing which of their products were affected. You'll get a CVE to patch mapping as far as what versions need to be applied to be fixed. Mitigation or workaround information, crucial in environments where you cannot shut down key equipment to patch. You don't have hot fixes in OT. Probably should have said that earlier. You don't need to restart your computer to apply this update. Absolutely not. You are reflashing firmware. You're not doing that on the fly. Revision history is also in the SIP compliance space, when you have to prove that you've gone and done your check for nerdy patches. You're taking a screenshot of that vendor advisory, because there are a couple of instances years ago of some vendors backdating advisories that then caused utilities to be out of compliance, because when they said we didn't find any patches, and then the auditors came and said, well, if I don't live on such and such's website, it says that the day before you said you checked, there was something published. And if you can't prove, I checked it on that day and there was nothing, you're out of luck. So there's a lot of screenshots being used as compliance evidence. And yet, with all of this crucial information, many of them aren't machine readable. There's little, if any, access to a feed of published URLs, and some are behind a login, paid or not. This is where you get a call to action, which is CISA. This was the only meme that made it into the presentation, but by golly, it's a good one. So CSAP is the common standard advisory format. It comes out of OASIS, primarily championed, at least at the moment, by BSI, the German Federal Cybersecurity Agency. It's a JSON schema. It's a structured language to create and update and share vendor security advisories, providing fields for all of these things that we get in a vendor advisory that we don't get in the NPD, because the NPD is for vulnerabilities, and an advisory has become a different beast. It's machine readable, of course, gives you the CVE to remediation mapping, whether that's a patch, whether that's a workaround or a mitigation, and it allows for automation. In OT, you can't scan things the way that you will in IT to determine what its vulnerabilities are. When you have devices that are so tailor-made to a purpose that they send and expect network requests and responses on a timer, so that every second or every minute you're sending something to the central system and getting something back. You go run in that device is going to say, "Oh, I have the RAM for this," and it's going to shut down. That is not something you want to happen in your day-to-day operations. So you don't have the same ability to automatically go say, "Let me go ping all of my systems and get information about what needs to be applied." Something like CSAP allows for audit information. Listen, I'm finishing grad school, hopefully very soon. There is a section of my dissertation, this is not a lie, that's about trying to identify and retrieve mitigation information from vendor security advisories. And I was at a conference 3 or 4 years ago, and Jens Weisner from BSI presented on CSAP. And I literally sat in the audience and went, "Well, that's useless." Referring to my dissertation, not CSAP, because CSAP just made that section, if not obsolete, but certainly less necessary. However, out of 447 CNAs, this past week, I checked, 18 that I'm aware of provide CSAP. That is, I didn't do math, a dismal percentage. To be quite honest, I don't mean to gloss over the difficulties that are present in providing advisories in a structure like this. There's a lot of overhead to get something like that set up and then to maintain it. However, with the amount of crucial information present in vendor security advisories and often nowhere else, I would implore you to consider providing your advisories in CSAP format, because it is quite literally revolutionary when we go into these operational environments to go from no automation, everything's done by hand, and you're screenshotting a page to prove that you checked it at a certain time, to being able to process things in an automated way. As a final call to action, when we talk to OT folks, there's a lot of words to say, talking about changing the mindset, going to a proactive focus on vulnerabilities as opposed to a reactive one for patches, and figuring out how we're going to secure operations sustainably for the IT folks, for the vulnerability researchers, for the vendors, and the ODMs. Consider the operational limitations. It's not that you have to change everything to cater to them, but things are different. And the phones, this isn't a hard problem, we've already fixed it over here, is not a helpful attitude when you're trying to approach things in operations. And maybe provide CSAP. If you could, that'd be great. Thank you all for being here. Contact information is here and up. We'll provide slides. And happy to take any questions. Oh yeah, there is a mic over there. And you ask you use the mic so that people on the stream can also hear the questions.
You feel free to reach out and get emails, anything. I mean, you could go on for operational technology for everybody. You can talk for days on this, right? Just an hour, just to scratch, this barely part of all the OT and everything that goes into it. So ask anything, ask what, reach out. You'll get it.
All right, can you hear me up there? That's okay. So it's a super common sort of talking point line of question. Everyone talked about it to you that these things are insecure because they're right. What's your take on things being insecure because they are too legal? With solutions of your using in these environments that are coming from startups who probably have been around long enough to have robust product security, vulnerability management, pen testing programs internally, and making also too new to garner a lot of attention from the research community, right? So like Shatter, like the Grapple GE, the researchers love us. It's a long bang for their buck. But a security startup that's maybe been around for 3 years, ideologically on their radar. And so do you think that you will start seeing a trend with things being insecure just not shooting? I hope not. But also, yes. I think there's a part of this that isn't dealt with what to plan for as someone, quite frankly, in a cybersecurity startup, knowing what to plan for. In the SIT states, there's a whole standard about supply chain and vendor management, and as part of that, it's called NATF, NATF, the North American Transmission Forum put together this absolutely massive questionnaire of questions for vendors to answer supply chain questions. I'll say from there's a part of that starts to inform how you spend your money, how you spend your time. Say, oh, they're gonna ask me, do I have a process to X? I should probably consider having process to do X. I think there are services and ways to look at pen testing from a contractual perspective, and ask for research or testing to be done on applications, even when you're not big enough to have a dedicated team internally. And I think there's a part on industry as well, but possibly not as large of a burden to evaluate vendors effectively. You can be a small team and have robust security policies. You can be a huge vendor and have lax security.
And one more thing I want to add to that, because there's one last piece of this a little bit, which is things being too not being secure because they can't interact with things that are too old, right? When I'm talking about the legacy systems, we're seeing things like Windows NT 93. Not many things are going to interact with that system anymore, right? And if that's something that's critical and it's running alongside all these new technologies, you might have vulnerabilities now that you have to mitigate and change in these new technologies because they interface with those old technologies. So it's not only that they're too new that they're remiss, that they're missing something that they need to be doing, but it's that they are new, and a lot of the stuff you're working with is old. And that introduces some new interdependencies, some new vulnerabilities, some things you have to worry about. Be mindful of.
All right, I have a question from the Explorer channel. OT life cycle is tied to hardware. It's big, expensive industrial life cycle, just measured a decade. However, software technology, OS platforms life cycle is relatively much shorter. How do you manage or expect OT, which is greater than 10 years old, having the security path, assuming in the first place we find that it has a vulnerability? Is there an alternative and practical solution to ensure these are
Mitigation. So yes, there's gonna be a lot of cases where there's not patch. I mean, there's not anything, and there's two avenues here. Technically three. If you have a mitigation from the vendor for a vulnerability, great, easy. Maybe that's turning off VLAN on a switch when you're not using VLAN, easy. It might say you'll mitigate this if you turn off VLAN, but you're using VLAN. Oh no, what do you do now? The answer is you have to look at security from a higher up view. There comes a point where you've got to have proper segmentation. There comes a point where that is the only recommendation that I could reasonably give to you to start to mitigate some of these things. I'm not talking about air gaps, Brian didn't get into air gaps, but talking about properly segmentation, restricting access. There's a level of risk that, especially with these older systems, you may have to accept. And your goal is to limit that risk as much as possible. And a lot of times that's going to be without patching available.
I'll speak that real quick with a fun land, especially the area I'm there. It truly is. It comes down to other mitigation controls, right? When you're dealing with the difference in hardware and software timelines, if your software timeline is much faster than your hardware timeline, you really truly might not be able to apply the patch. You might not be able to do the same mitigating controls, and so other mitigating controls besides patching is key to that. For example, there's a plant that I've been to that on their air gap network. When I say air gap, like location curve, that network, it said it was their air gap network, it was their bounce plant network. It was running operations. It was running on Windows XP, right? But it has no connections to the outside, right? I say air gap applications because it does. Maybe not a concept from the outside, but maybe on its commissioning. Maybe when you build the system, it's from the outside. Maybe when a vendor walked in with our laptops to do maintenance, there was something there. We're USB, right? We were doing work on this facility, and we actually found a worm inside the air gap network, transplant network. And we looked at the worm and did a little bit of forensics. We found out that work had been on the system for at least 12 years. At least that's when the backup stopped, and I couldn't tell if the worm was still in the system anymore because I couldn't see any part of back in 12 years, right? And so it's important that they had this Dave software hardware problem now of how do we deal with this work on a system that's running Windows XP that can't connect to anywhere? What could we do? They then had to try and find. They were working with companies trying to say, "Hey, can you guys give us a product that can, a vulnerability scanner or something that we can try to get into this air network that runs on Windows XP anymore?" They kind of a lot of vendors don't do Windows XP anymore. They had a big problem. And so they fought and fought and fought and had this big disconnect between the software of today and the hardware of yesterday, right? And so that is a big problem. So
I have a question from research perspective. Uh, how would you recommend someone to simulate an OT effort? Like, is it advisable to have a software emulation, or would you recommend having a physical lab with OT systems? Or like, what's the power? Let's say someone has a software simulation, and what's the parity? Someone that's on one console, like, let's say a baseline and then a kind of result, manage or some other name would be related.
Yeah. So I would say both, depending on your resources. If a software, a virtual system is what's feasible, then that's what's feasible. Then I love playing around with hardware, so I'm gonna say it's hard to have a little lab. It is also good. There are things that can come up with these environments that aren't properly or aren't well simulated in a virtual environment. If you want to simulate email or come chat after, I just more examples.
Thank you. Perfect. And I'll provide, I'll provide some scenario. And you're talking about the difference in data science and development networks, for example, and testing networks and testing beds for a lot of these different vulnerabilities. Research should, in the IT world, right, using development networks, using testing networks before you do this is critical. It's important. And sometimes it might be easier than the OT world, right? When we're working with thousands of devices, like I said, but there are thousands of devices, but maybe they're actually truly 5 or 6 different devices, right? It'd be pretty easy to build a test network or a test net, to go through those for one of the research purposes, because all we do is 6 different devices, right? But in the OT world, development networks are there and testing networks are there, and in some cases required. But those networks tend to be a little bit different, right? Because we're dealing with 250 assets that maybe, let's say, there's 100 unique assets of those 250, right? They're already different devices. They're all interconnected in a different way. A lot of those assets probably don't even have network connectivity. So a testbed network might not necessarily help unless you're making sure you're doing IP plus serial plus all these other connections. And at the same time, it can be hard to make sure you have a testbed like that. Like I said, I've been doing facilities with a Windows NT93. You don't find me those computers anymore. You want to go buy another computer, put in your test guide network that runs Windows NT93, good luck. Have fun trying to find one that still runs on a floppy disk drive. Let me tell you, it's a big surprise when I went under the desk there to try to find the computer and not recognizing the Windows system, and then trying to go plug a USB into a floppy disk drive when I opened it. When I went down there, I was like, oh yeah, that's not like, well. So the problem is, test bed networks are good, development networks are good, and I'm a proponent for them. Great, please use them, try your best. But in the LT world, a lot of times those test bed networks fall short, and truly will only have most critical assets, or even if they're not the most critical, they'll have, as many critical or important assets as they can that can actually work in those test bed environments. Because, like I said, it is sometimes you just can't build a fully capable test bed network development environment because of the difficulties with OT technology.
I have a small remark regarding vendors and customer relations. So when I talk to OT folks, they can say, "Yeah, we're just one company and we're just such a small entity." But don't underestimate your power as operation. Since
These unmade power plants are huge in that years, but probably tells the wider they focus and how many vendors are there. Because without that much range of your harvest would of the one range that your range runs. But also means you have much more power once you're in the stage that it reflects. So don't underestimate that. PSI release a technical guideline and connect the right in one sentence to truly contract and say vendor has to comply with and there's some lines with PSI technical guideline there are 3.1 and that basically says the whole thing provide security at batteries and SAP made them accessible or enabled have the controls in place that we have the data that we need as graders to actually act on that. And pretty front lines, wherever about it was. That should help you.
And yes, 100%. Thank you 100% for your comment, and I wholeheartedly agree. Remember, it's important. GE, for example, not to GE, I love you. Both comes badly out of this. Special GE, for example, there's, you might be a power company and say, I don't think she's gonna listen. If I tell them I want something, they're not gonna listen to me. They have these surveys, so many other companies worldwide, industries wide. They do so much. You remember, you have power, you have important, right? Just because there's not many doesn't mean you're not important, or you can't make changes, you can't ask for more, because you are key, you are critical. You are the critical infrastructure, right? GE still needs power. Don't forget, right? So make sure you do. If you can't get there, please do work with your vendors. Please work with OEMs. It's not, we're not saying it's not, it's scary. Don't work with them. They're not your. The vendors want to work with you. You should want to work with the vendors. Please utilize that, and don't forget the power of a chat. Like I said, thank you to Black Heart. So nice.